Have you ever imagined empires that shook the world? Most immediately picture the British Empire, with its maps covered in red, or perhaps Rome with its legions marching throughout ancient streets. But have you ever stopped to wonder about the first empire on which the sun truly never set? Have you ever imagined a world where your own kingdom controlled territories? From the Americas to Asia, where silver from Peru flowed to China, where chocolate from Mexico became the fashion in Paris, and where a single monarch could claim to rule over 4 continents. Did you know that Spain, a country smaller than Texas, once controlled 13% of the world's entire land area, and that its currency, the Spanish real, was the global trade standard for over 2 centuries? What if I told you that this empire's rise was built not just on swords, but on a desperate search for spices, and its fall came not from defeat, but from the very wealth that made it powerful? If these questions make you curious, then the story of how Spain built and lost the first truly global empire in human history will completely reshape your understanding of power, luck, and the devastating price of easy money. The story begins not with strength, but with fragmentation. In the late 1400s, Spain didn't even exist as a unified country. The Iberian Peninsula was divided into competing kingdoms, with the most powerful being Castile in the center and Aragon in the east. For nearly 800 years, Christian kingdoms had been slowly pushing back. Muslim rulers who had controlled much of Spain since 711 AD, this long struggle called the Reconquista created a society hardened by war, deeply religious, and hungry for glory. In 1469, Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella of Castile married, uniting the 2 largest Christian kingdoms. Together known as the Catholic monarchs, they completed the Reconquista in 1492 by capturing Granada, the last Muslim stronghold. That same year, they made 3 decisions that changed world history forever. They expelled Spain's Jewish population, stabilized the Spanish Inquisition to enforce religious purity, and agreed to finance a desperate Italian sailor named Christopher Columbus, who believed he could reach Asia by sailing west. Columbus never reached Asia, of course. Instead, he stumbled upon islands in the Caribbean, inaugurating European contact with the Americas. At first, this seemed like a disappointment. Where were the rich spice markets of India? Where were the great cities of China? But then, within a decade, Spanish explorers realized they had found something potentially even more valuable: vast empires rich in gold and silver, populated by millions of people who had no immunity to European diseases. In 1519, Hernan Cortes landed on the coast of Mexico with about 600 men, 16 horses, and a few cannons. Within 2 years, he had destroyed the Aztec Empire, captured its capital Tenochtitlan, and sent its emperor Moctezuma to his death. In 1532, Francisco Pizarro repeated this feat in Peru, with even fewer men, capturing the Inca emperor Atahualpa and eventually destroying the largest empire in the Americas. How was this possible? Partly through Spanish military technology and ruthless tactics, but mostly it was disease. Smallpox, measles, and other European illnesses swept through indigenous populations, killing perhaps 90% of the native people within the first century of contact. The Spanish didn't conquer empty lands, but they conquered lands emptied by germs they didn't even understand. The wealth that began flowing back to Spain was unlike anything Europe had ever seen. From 1520 to 1789, Spanish treasure fleets regularly transported American silver and gold across the Atlantic. The first major silver discovery came at Potosi in modern Bolivia in 1545, a mountain so rich that it produced over 60% of all silver mined worldwide during the 16th and 17th centuries. This wealth funded Spanish wars across Europe, built magnificent palaces and churches, and made Spain the dominant power of its age. Under Charles I, who was also Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, and his son Philip II, Spain controlled not just the Americas, but also large parts of Italy, and Asia. In 1580, Spain even absorbed Portugal and its empire, giving Spanish kings control of Brazil, African trading posts, and Asian territories from Goa to Macau. For a few decades, Spain stood at the center of what was genuinely the first global empire in human history. But this empire was built on foundations that could not last. The most immediate problem was that the wealth was not creating wealth. Instead of investing American silver in domestic industries, Spanish monarchs spent it on foreign wars and imported luxury goods. The massive influx of silver actually caused inflation across Europe, making Spanish goods uncompetitive and ultimately hurting the domestic economy. Meanwhile, the indigenous populations of the Americas were being worked to death in mines and on plantations through systems like the encomienda and repartimiento, which essentially treated native people as forced labor. In 1550, a remarkable debate took place at Valladolid between Bartolomé de las Casas, who argued that indigenous people were human beings with souls deserving protection, and Juan Gines de Sepulveda, who claimed they were natural slaves. The fact that such a debate even occurred shows that some Spaniards recognized the moral horror of their empire. But the practical outcome changed little. Millions died and Spain's wealth depended on this exploitation. The 16th century was Spain's golden age, but the seeds of decline were already visible. The Spanish Armada's failed invasion of England in 1588 was not immediately catastrophic, but it symbolized the growing challenge from Protestant Northern Europe. The Dutch revolt beginning in 1568 drained Spanish resources for 80 years and eventually created an independent Netherlands that would become Spain's commercial rival. Spain's involvement in endless European religious wars defending Catholicism against Protestantism meant that American silver flowed straight through Spain to pay foreign bankers, arms dealers, and mercenaries. By the time Philip II died in 1598, Spain had defaulted on its debts multiple times. The 17th century brought what Spaniards called the Siglo de Oro, or Golden Age, in culture with extraordinary achievements in painting, literature, and theology. Cervantes wrote Don Quixote. Velázquez painted his masterpieces, and Spanish mystics like Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross transformed Catholic spirituality. But politically and economically, this was a century of decline. The Habsburg dynasty, through constant inbreeding, produced increasingly inco rulers. Philip IV was dominated by his chief minister, the Count Duke of Olivares, whose desperate attempts to reform the empire failed against entrenched privilege and regional resistance. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648 recognized Dutch independence and marked the end of Spanish dominance in European affairs. Portugal revolted in 1640 and successfully regained independence after 28 years of struggle. The final blow to Habsburg Spain came with the death of Charles II in 1700. This pathetic king, physically and mentally disabled, unable to produce children, waste product of generations of Habsburg cousin marriage. His death triggered the War of Spanish Succession, which ended with the Peace of Utrecht in 1713. Spain lost its European possessions outside the Iberian Peninsula, lost Gibraltar to Britain, and saw its empire drastically reduced. The new Bourbon dynasty descended from French kings attempted modernization, but could not reverse centuries of economic distortion. Spain remained a major colonial power in the Americas, but it was no longer the dominant force in world affairs. The 18th century was a period of relative stability, but also of growing vulnerability. The Bourbon reforms improved administration, strengthened the military, and promoted some economic development. But Spain's empire was increasingly a target for rival powers. British forces captured Havana and Manila during the 7 Years' War, returning them only at the peace treaty. The American Revolution, while it cost Britain its 13 colonies, also inspired independence movements throughout Spanish America. When Napoleon invaded Spain in 1808 and placed his brother Joseph on the throne, he provided the perfect opportunity for colonial elites to reject European authority. Between 1811 and 1825, led by figures like Sim Aúnbal Iver and José de San Martin, virtually all of Spain's mainland, American colonies achieved independence. What remained was a shadow empire: Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and some scattered Pacific islands. Spain fought costly wars to retain Cuba, and the expansion intervened in Cuba's rebellion and destroyed Spanish naval forces in Manila Bay and Santiago de Cuba. The Spanish-American War lasted only 10 weeks but cost Spain its last major colonies and marked its definitive end as an imperial power. The generation of 98 Spanish intellectuals who witnessed this humiliation spent decades diagnosing what had gone wrong with their country. Yet even this was not quite the end. Spain retained territories in North Africa, including Spanish Sahara, which it held until 1975. The legacy of empire lived in the 500 million Spanish speakers worldwide in the Catholic Church's global reach in the cultural fusion of mestizo societies, from Mexico to Argentina, and in the enduring economic and social inequalities that conquest and colonization created. The Spanish Empire had connected the world in new ways, bringing together peoples, plants, animals, and diseases from previously isolated continents. The Columbian Exchange, as historians call this, transferred of Europe potatoes, tomatoes, chocolate, and tobacco while bringing wheat, horses, cattle, and devastating epidemics to the Americas. And so what should we make of this empire that rose so fast and fell so slowly? It was built on extraordinary courage and extraordinary cruelty, on genuine religious conviction and cynical exploitation, on luck and on tragedy. The Spanish conquistadors were not supermen, they were desperate men in desperate times, gambling everything on the chance of riches and winning through a combination of technology, tactics, and the devastating the wealth they found destroyed the society that received it, creating inflation, dependency, and eventually decline. Spain's empire lasted from 1492 to 1898. Over 4 centuries, but its most powerful period was relatively brief, perhaps a century at most. Story of the Spanish Empire reminds us that power is not just about territory or wealth, but about how that wealth is used. It shows us that empires built on extraction rather than production, on conquest rather than collaboration, may dazzle for a time but cannot sustain themselves. It demonstrates how the connections created by empire outlast the empire itself, shaping languages, cultures, religions, and inequalities that persist for centuries. Victories may contain the seeds of future. Defeat at the Mountain of Silver at Potosi brought Spain temporary and permanent distortion. So the next time you eat chocolate, drink a coffee, or hear Spanish spoken somewhere in the world, remember that these are echoes of an empire that once connected continents. An empire that began with a wrong turn in the through courage that spent its wealth faster than it could create it, and that finally dissolved not with a bang, but with a series of whimpers across decades of decline. The Spanish Empire was the first truly global empire in human history.